Good evening, Europe. Nice noon, United States of America. Welcome the audience. Welcome our guest for today. The topic of our conversation will be about social media and immigrant communities. The guest today is Professor Andrea Hickerson. She's Dean and Professor at the School of Journalism and New Media at the University of Mississippi in the United States. My name is David Campbell. I'm an associate professor for comparative political science at the University of Vienna. To begin with, Andrea, if one is coming from the academia, one always likes to refer to the so-called definition of terms. Given that for our talk, immigrant communities on the one hand and social media on the other represent key concepts, at the beginning, I would like to ask you, what type of definition would you want to offer, so to say, for these two concepts? As you wish, either talking about social media first and immigrant communities second, or the other way, but I think this is also, for reasons of clarification, always a good starting point.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here. And I very much appreciate this question because I've given it a lot of thought in my work, particularly on the what do we mean by immigrant communities. So the term I favor is transnational communities, because I think that's a good umbrella term that connotates different experiences. Immigrants, we typically think of as individuals who left a country of origin and have moved more permanently into a country of residence. But other related populations, of course, would be migrants, who it might be a temporary situation where the intention is to go back. And these are important orientations for variables about how people will interact with media. It could be people that are forced into exile and consider themselves part of a global diaspora. I think all of those terms fit in this realm. So I would use all of them today. And I will also note in my research, there's different regional, I guess, preferences. So when you're looking at a lot of research on immigration in Europe, you're more likely to see the word migrant. In the United States, you're more likely, I think, to see immigrants. Sometimes you'll see asylum seeker. That would be another thing. Refugee. I think all of these populations that are transient and have some kind of reference point between a country of origin and a country of residence. With regards to the term social media, I think of social media as it's a platform agnostic term. And I think there's different, we will talk about, I'm sure, differences in preferences on social media. There are countries that use one platform over another. But in terms of a general definition, I would say these are networked, interpersonal digital networks that are also public facing. So they are semi-private, that you could have side conversations with people, but then they also have a public side of that is, people can interact with other actors outside their community.
Well, I think you opened up a very interesting space of communication and discourse. If I understood you correctly, you would say the focus in Europe would be more on migrants and in the US on immigrants. Is this correct?
Yes.
Well, the terms in that sense sound similar, but there's always, of course, a reason if you have deviations. So
Right.
in your opinion, what would be the difference between a migrant and an immigrant? And then again, of course, contextualize the society and politics. How would possible ramifications then differ in Europe in contrast to the United States?
Sure. So I'll start with the United States, which I can speak more to from experience, but there still is this conception in our national narrative and our founding that we are a nation of immigrants, right? And so that is a defining place that we have gone to and a place that we are staying. When we use other terms in the US, and I think we are starting to hear in public discourse more terms like migrant crisis, that's a bit more transitory. So suddenly it's shifting the discussion of they might not stay, where immigrants, it's this idea of permanence is implied. In some of the literature I've read in Europe more recently, it was written at a time where there were a lot of Syrian migrants are, refugees or asylum
Mhm.
seekers coming in there as well. And that puts it more in a political stance. That's what do we do about these people that are suddenly coming here? So I think just reflecting critically on the literature, there's embedded in an idea of permanence. Is this a permanent issue, or is this a transitory episodic type of issue?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, I think, so to say, a little bit digging it this forward. Um, so if you basically would argue that the US, and of course, in a certain extent, this reflects, in that sense, the vision and the self-understanding of the US, it's a society somehow crafted or created by immigration. And I think you pointed very subtle, perhaps, to the differences in Europe. So migrants may be coming, maybe going, whatever happens to these. And between the lines, maybe we could say, well, European nations often do not consider themselves that directly as a product of immigration. Maybe also, in a certain sense, European nations like to think about themselves as having existed for centuries, if not millennia, or in that sense, um, so to say, forever. Now, in certain discourses then taking place in the US, and as we know, in November we're having elections in the United States. Maybe we also can refer to these a little bit later. Do you think that also the discourses and the narratives now in the US context are diversifying themselves, in the sense that also there is somehow now a form of distinction between immigration on the one hand and migration on the other? Potentially also different loadings, in the sense, is it a positive or critical meaning? Does something like this occur in the US? A distinction between, let's say, welcomed immigration, potentially criticized migration, or is this too far going? Or is, in that sense, the discourse in the US still in a status of unclearness, if these distinctions, so to say, may occur?
Mhm. I do think that we're at a transition point in the US about using these terms,
Mhm.
because when they talk about kind of the founding nation as a nation of immigrants, it's said with pride, right? And it's coming from a position of strength. But one of the most polarizing issues in the US right now is the crisis at the border, right? And that's how conceived as a crisis with migrants coming through. They're not immigrants, because again, if we were to describe that as an immigration problem, it would imply that we're going to keep them. But politically, they don't, people are saying that's not what they're saying, right? They want to figure out where else to put them, right? And so that has become a hot button issue, regardless of political parties. And it's an interesting issue because it is getting traction in communities that aren't border communities. The United States is very large, and so there's a lot of people that this is not a real issue for. However, there have been politicians in Texas, and I believe in Florida as well, who have taken busloads of people that have crossed the U.S. border and
Mhm.
put them in new places like New York City or other cities. And it has become, unfortunately, a political game chip, because the point that the communities closer to the border are saying is this is a strain on our social services. And they're saying, oh, these liberals that are not close to the
Mhm.
border, well, if you think it's not that big a deal, you can provide these services for you instead. So that's one element of it. And another element that we're not hearing up so much now, but we did a few years ago, was refugees. So I do think that there is a larger sense about those are two different communities: refugees that are escaping something from war and they need to come here instead. Traditionally, the United States has welcomed a lot of refugees, but the number has decreased over time. And that can be very political too, about what kinds of refugees do we want to accept, what countries are acceptable to take them from. And so those are kind of held as two separate conversations. And the other thing I'll say about the crisis at the border now is how it's being tied to other things. It's not just about people, but there's overt claims that this is what's causing the drug crisis here. And so it has become kind of a rhetorical theater, if you will, for the problems of the
Mhm.
United States being tied to the border itself.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I mean, would then in that sense the implication be to say that in the American political discourse, there's a distinction in the sense of saying it's not immigration which is the problem, or let's say illegal immigration, but in that sense, illegal migration.
Yes,
Is basically this the way how,
correct.
so to say,
Yes.
the the political fault lines
Mhm.
are moving, because in that sense, of course, what is interesting that, I mean, as we all know that um, some politicians or semi politicians in the US who talk critically about migration themselves have, so to say, roots of immigration, either themselves or with their families and the spouses. But the point would be basically to say the point is not being against immigration, but it's in that sense a critical reassessment of migration. Is it
That's
this in
correct.
that sense what you want to refer to? Which I
Yes.
think is a very interesting distinction, because I think in the in the European discourses about the US, there have not been that many references to these types of distinctions. And then, of course, we're also running it into language. So the point would be, well, how do you translate a distinction between immigration and migration
Right.
to the different European languages? But beyond this, so to say, in your view and your assessment and the way, so to say, how you academically deal with these questions, has also immigration, or however we want to sort of say, use this term, in that sense, have also the patterns of immigration changed to the US? I mean, of course, there are different ways of thinking about this. The one would be, well, to say from which countries the immigrants come from.
Mhm.
But beyond this, also in that sense, there are patterns. So we may want to say that in the, let's say, in the past, immigration into the US was more in the sense of a one-way street. So you would move into the US and then you would stay there.
Mhm.
Um, are there now, in that sense, or how would you see it, nuances, but basically saying, well, perhaps you migrate into the US, but you keep the ties to your original communities, either you yourself or, let's say, with generations, one or two generations before. But this also may be creating some new globalized forms, living in the US as an immigrant, but maybe also living at the same time in the country of origin. Again, either you or family members are seen in a bigger generational relationship. I mean, I thought, for instance, I once saw a very interesting documentation about immigrants from Senegal into France.
Mm.
So this was the first generation, and then the second, but even more so in the third generation, let's say, like with the grandchildren wanting to rebuild bridges back to Senegal. I think in several cases there would be dual citizens, so it was the French citizens, but maybe they kept the Senegalese citizenship, yes. And then they would say, well, how to take the African heritage, combine it with the French experience, and
Mhm.
doing something good or interesting and innovative for Senegal, but France at the same time, yes. And then maybe they go back, or they go back and forth, or they set up businesses in Senegal, but keep their businesses in France, etc. I thought this was very interesting. Would you also, in that sense, see to a certain extent patterns like this emerging or developing in the context of immigration into the US, or not? Or what could be said about this in a current status?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really interesting variables that you just highlighted. Um, Traditionally, there have been gateway cities in the United States where a lot of immigrant communities came. So big cities like New York City, or Miami, or even Houston, Texas. But what we're finding is that there are smaller cities that are labor dependent that have welcomed immigrants, in some cases more than the traditional gateway cities. So they could be small cities in North Carolina, for example, that were reliant on labor. They needed people to do the work. Um, And so they have been coming up. So that's been one variable. And then another variable you mentioned too that's come up is the second generation. And sometimes, you know, the older generation has been focused more or less on assimilation. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean in the sense of, how do I enroll my children in school? How do I understand the social services here? So it's been a kind of a practical assimilation in the community. But that second generation that might not have the ties to where they came from are engaged. So they are, maybe it's a small engagement on social media, or maybe it's participating in a Spanish language football league. There are a lot of those in rural communities in the US where the players only speak Spanish. So it has become more of I guess a casual identity. I mean, it's very important, but I did some research years ago looking at the political angle, because thinking, oh, now you can participate in, you know, your country of origin. And they really weren't, was the big takeaway, you know. And I think that as theorists, sometimes we think, oh, look at this great possibility. And it just didn't really matter for the people in the day-to-day lives that were focused on the basics. The other thing I'd like to say is that we are seeing too secondary migration in the US too. So, and this is more in refugee communities, where communities from a country might be sponsored and located in a certain country, but then they find out there's more people from Bhutan actually live in a different city instead. And so we are seeing secondary migration within cities as well. And I think that's often quite understudied, but it speaks to that interpersonal networks, where people feel like they can have a sense of home. But again, it's not going back. It's just finding that kind of shared community in the US.
Hmm. I mean, I mean, talking about terms. So, as we said before, migration or migrants, to a certain extent, may have something like a political and negative connotation, to put it like this. Immigration was perhaps the concept of the past, where persons would move into the US.
Mhm.
Now, wanting to describe such new phenomena, let's say, of migration, what would be the words we should possibly use? So is then in that sense also a terminology evolving, which goes a little bit beyond immigration and migration? Because of course in the word immigration, perhaps there's the assumption you move from A into B and you stay there.
Right.
And as you've said, in the second and third generation, this may be seen in a different way. Migration is caught up or scapegoated a little bit in those political debates. So how could this second or third generation phenomenon perhaps be called, where persons would say, well, on the one, I mean, we could also paraphrase it as multiple identities, of basically saying, yes, it's a fact. It was my
Mhm.
parents or grandparents have migrated into the US, and therefore, of course, I'm an American now. But on the other hand, rediscovering, in that sense, my other origins or affiliations, and also seeing myself as a global citizen. So being an American citizen and a global citizen at the same time, yes.
Mhm.
Um, so what are the words or the terms in that sense then
Right.
describing that group of persons, which may be increasing or not? At least I do not know, but for sure this is also in that sense a certain strand of identification. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
What
And I
does
think
what does modern science about, or so to say, a modern researcher like you say
right.
about this? Because it's always, of course, a quest and contest of terms in that sense, yes,
Yes.
and the branding, conceptual branding. So how could we, in that sense, then address these phenomena? What would you suggest in the sense of terminology, how this could be
Right.
phrased, rephrased, understood?
Right. I favor the word transnational, because I feel like
Transnational, yes.
that's really broad and it doesn't imply a political stance. Now, the critique could be that it's too broad, right? And
Hmm.
then there's different, areas within there, and I think that's fine. An alternative approach would be to go very narrow and use legalistic definitions. So, for
Hmm.
example, we can define a refugee in a very specific, particular status. Um, you could talk about legal immigrants or permanent residents.
Hmm.
But I think there's dangers in using that kind of political legalized language to talk about people, particularly in the United States, where there are about 2 million young people who came to the United States with their parents that were undocumented, that have no official legal status, right? So I think we leave out that very important group. They're called the Dreamers in the United States after the name of an act that was what was it called? Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So the Dreamers, how do we classify that? So that's why I favor the transnational, but I think sometimes using those legal terms can be a bit helpful to describe something, but then they exclude others. So it is a bit of a thorny issue, and particularly in academic research when you're trying to make comparisons against different groups. I have seen some analyses that have looked at the push-pull factors to distinguish different groups, like if they are they moved because of labor reasons or moved because of political reasons. Those could be things. Because it's true. I think, we have the conception that a lot of people that migrate, immigrate, all those words, refugees are impoverished, right? But not all immigrants are impoverished. And, some of them are quite wealthy or come from a higher status, but that gets kind of obscured in these conversations. And it's happening now a little bit in the context of the US election. There's a lot of talk about the Spanish-speaking voting bloc and how they feel about the border crisis. And some of them actually favor a very strict policy at the border, and that seems to confuse people. But I don't know why it should, because they would come from different circumstances completely, right? So we have made it a reductive issue about identity when it's much more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we should refer to this topic then a little bit later. So this appears, paraphrasing a little bit the title of our talk today. There could be something like a nexus of immigration, migration, and transnationalism, or
Yes.
transnationalism, which of course is also in that sense would be a very interesting topic. Now, bridging over to the social media, and in that sense, of course, maybe then a little bit having in the back of our minds possible distinctions between social media on the one hand and traditional media on the other. I mean, maybe even if sketched more in the sense of working hypothesis, are there certain distinctions in the sense between the social media, how they function, how they deliver messages, etc. So this whole complex of social media interacting with migration and immigration, is this in that sense different than traditional media would interact with migration and immigration, or not, or what could be said about this, or which hypothesis may we develop? Yes, are there nuances, so to say, and if so, what are the possible differences in that sense of traditional media and social media, vice versa, this whole nexus of immigration and migration?
Great. So I think that the early work, like when the internet was coming out and people were focused on populations like this, they were very excited that there would be this automatic liberation for these groups, that they could challenge dominant narratives through social media, and that this was going to be transformative for these groups. And looking back on that over the past 25 years, it strikes me as a bit naive for a number of reasons. Is that, I mean, what social media has done is it's allowed people to communicate more frequently than sending letters or phone calls, and they can do it through their cell phones very quickly. And so that has changed, I guess, the frequency and intensity of communication against dispersed communities. It's also enabled ties, especially in groups that maybe they didn't want to leave. It was a forced dispersal. They can keep in touch with family members there much easier. So it has made connections. It has made care easier. But if we're talking about social media as in challenging a narrative, I think we were a bit naive about that. And that's where it gets into like the traditional legacy media is that they all have social media preferences. They have large audiences, and those audiences and narratives are replicated in online spaces. So it's still very difficult for any minority group to challenge the dominant narrative to get their story out, because it's still, social media spaces are still dominated by majorities.
Okay. I mean, do you? I mean, would you go so far to say that? Okay, let's pose it differently. I mean, listening to what you have described, I mean, perhaps one interpretation would be to say at the beginning there was a certain progressive expectation how social media might work. Yes, social media in connection with the internet, liberating, freeing everyone, so everybody could raise his voice. He would create a plurality, a diversity, or pluralism of society and discourses, which of course could have something like a progressive impact. However, of course, one defines progressiveness. And over time, there was more sobering up. Yes, something maybe like a backlash against an over progressive impact of the social media, and some notifications that in that sense everybody or every political opinion could be pronounced, articulated, and reproduced in the frame of social media. Something like a sobering about the
Yeah.
progressiveness. Is this a little bit a type of a message which you have delivered? Um, and if so, what has changed in that sense within the dynamics of social media?
Yes, I like the way that you've characterized it. And I think it just became frustrating for minority groups. Even if they could get their voices out there, the circumstances on the ground or the political process couldn't keep up with the speed of communication and the progressive ideas that were there. But I think what we have seen, though, is a shift in tactics from, if we're talking about organized activity from immigrant, migrant, transnational groups. And part of that is understanding the limitations and the strengths of different platforms. And so I can give you an example about this that's from the US political context recently. So former President Trump, who's running, of course, again, in a debate, made a comment about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating cats and dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a robust online Haitian newspaper in the United States called the Haitian Times from 1999, who has been covering the Haitian community. And so they respond to it, but they also are producing lots of news about the Haitian community that, again, is mostly shared in Haitian online social or civil social networks. But what it did is when that came into the news, we started to see those articles, those tweets, people involved in those being picked up by the mainstream media. So the power was granted, if you will, by traditional media. And so I think that is the tactic people are still trying to make, is how do you switch that narrative, but it has to be more organized. And it's often in tandem with very normal news organizations. So there still is a very robust immigrant press in the United States for a lot of reasons. One is linguistic, right? People need to learn basic news in their own language. And that still is much more powerful. And that surprised me in my earlier research. I set out to do a project about the immigrant press in the digital age. And I found out they really weren't in the digital age, even though the people I was talking to were very progressive and technically savvy. The communities we're talking about are early adopters of technology. But yet, when it came down to their lived communities, they were still very analog and using newspapers in some cases, classified advertisements in their native languages. And that was building that sense of community there. So social media is a point of connection. I think it helps people collaborate across community. But to the day-to-day stuff and individual lived experiences, it doesn't help as much.
Mm-hmm. Looking a little bit into the future, and in that sense, on the possible future evolution of social media, in that sense, what scenarios there may be, which factors are going to drive social media further. Are there any speculations on your side? Yes, so looking at what has happened, I mean, I would say in a certain sense, probably the internet
Mhm.
extended into massification, maybe yes, in the 1990s in Europe as of 2000 and afterwards. And of course, you have then the development of the social media. What are some speculations and expectation on your side how this landscape of social media may look like in 5 years, in 10
Mhm.
years, in 15 years, possibly in interaction with AI or not, and
Right.
other factors is so what may be happening there in that sense with the dynamics further driving developments of and within the social media.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, right now we've got a lot of large social media
Mhm,
companies, and there's a lot of content out there, and there's a lot of risk, right? If you're a community that is a political community and trying to organize, it might not be safe to organize and have connections play out like that. And so, what I think my speculative idea for the future of transnational online communities is that we're going to see closed networks exclusively for these communities, that it will be a bit of a
mhm,
hybrid. As developing platforms gets a little bit easier, and if you're using it for a smaller community, I think we could see some very interesting closed social media networks, maybe that only cater to a particular group, because it's too easy to get lost in these larger
mhm,
platforms. And then the other thing is that these platforms are pretty transient too, right? So like, Facebook in the United States right now is an older demographic. But then if you go to another country, everybody's on Facebook and using it as a commerce platform too. So there's always going to have to be compromises, I think, in the structure and the hybridity of these spaces. So I think we might, if I'm being positive,
mhm,
see
mhm,
very interesting networks that don't. I mean, we could see the network become the creative space, and so I think that's one way. And then I still think we will still see a persistence of analog communication. Whether it's
mhm,
boutique printed products and then text messaging. I think text messaging in these communities is overlooked as a communication tool, but there's something very trusting and interpersonal about having people specific context and doing group chats, that's a very
mhm,
powerful way to create relationships.
mhm. Um, and referring to AI, um, I mean, I think in a certain sense, it's quite obvious that the internet and social media are representing, let's say, ecosystems very well designed for AI. But the point is a little bit which factor may be stronger. In that sense, will it be that the internet and the social media will be further augmented and supported because there is AI, or will it be that AI, in that sense, will be the primary force, so to say,
Right.
overtaking the social media and in connection with the yes, internet, with the social media. So who will it be? Who will it be prevailing? As social media incorporating AI, or basically AI hiding between behind, so to say,
Yeah.
social media, and in that sense, what types of scenarios could emerge out of this cooperation or conflict or competition between social media, internet, and AI? Uh-huh.
Yeah. I I I think that AI is going to saturate traditional social media platforms. And
Mhm,
I think that that will alienate people looking for authenticity, and they will go build their own versions of that. The problems with AI is a lot of the tools are hegemonic. They're,
mhm,
Western centric. They're trained on English language models, right? They are going to be of small utility to the types of communication and the groups that we're talking about. Of course, if they're going to affect those communities, they'll have to learn those skills and create their own algorithmic accountability. But I think it's going to dilute authentic communication. And I
mhm,
think we might see some really interesting hybrid cyborg type of social media spaces that are created more purposefully as opposed to a single catch-all, which may be losing vogue. I don't know, but people are going to be looking for those spaces. I see it, even with students now at the university looking for those authentic communication spaces. So I don't know. I think it's probably a both, right? It's how it's built, but I think it's also the next thing that has to happen for us to get there would be kind of AI skills are still somewhat specialized. The tools are not; they're more consumer facing. But those of us that can't develop an AI, those will have to be better distributed across communities, and then we'll start seeing better products. And I hope that happens sooner than later before it all becomes
Okay.
very generational.
Before finally, so to say, focusing on politics. Now, in your opinion, could you indicate or mention or raise, let us say, a few positive examples how social media in that sense have supported the case of immigration and migration into the US? So are there, in your opinion, some interesting examples how migrant or immigrant communities are using social media, how here initiatives of cooperation were established, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. I think that immigrant social media has been very helpful in personalizing trend stories, right? When newspapers were well read, people would try to personify a story through an individual's story, their life story. And we see that less, and we see overview stories, but social media lets people tell their own versions of that. And a specific version of that is something I mentioned before about the dreamers. These are a lot of young adults who grew up in the United States who don't have a legal status. And even though that legislation got held up, they were incredibly effective about talking about themselves and their contributions to society as normal, hardworking people. And that it challenged the dominant narrative of these are a bunch of people coming to drain America of its resources. I think that's one good example too. And then I think also I'll pull out the Haitian Times example because that's very recent as well, where they have done a terrific job of covering Haitian Americans. So that way, when it does pop up in the news because a national politician says something, they can point to this whole body of work that's really robust. So they're not just part of an episodic news cycle. They can better contextualize the contributions that Haitian Americans are making to the United States.
Now, in our, so to say, final session of our talk, in that sense, referring to politics, and as we all know, there are presidential and congressional elections scheduled for this November. What in that sense, and of course you've referred to the so-called political issue of the border crisis, etc. Now, in reference to the self-identity of voters in the US, it's if you would see yourself as being an immigrant or belonging to an immigration community, or seeing yourself in the second or third generation, and of course also in that sense, your parents could have come from different regions in the world, or let's say your spouse or your husband or other family members. Now, how, in that sense, may this impact voting decisions? Is it possible to say that, and in that sense, of course, there will be this for the presidential race, so to say, Trump versus Harris. So seeing it as a bigger picture, persons with a self-identification of belonging somehow to an immigration community, would they have some type of a political leaning, generally speaking, and more specifically speaking, which arrangements within these communities could favor, let's say, either a Democratic or a Republican leaning? Because, of course, it's also imaginable that immigrants do not see themselves as one unified bloc, but of course you would have several distinctions. And then, of course, there are also many differences according to the generation, of the first generation that came in, but maybe in the second or third generation, then other nuances are occurring. So in terms of modern social sciences or political science, whatever we know or have in that sense, as a result of modern inquiry, what could be said about this phenomenon of immigration? How does this potentially play into the outcome of the election scheduled for November?
Right. It's a really interesting question. The election is so tight. And all anybody says, if they're predicting one side will win, it shows how little they know because it is just so tight. So given that it's so tight, it's hard to imagine that this would be the defining issue. I'm also really struck by, of the 2 presidential candidates and the 2 vice presidential candidates, 3 of them have immigration stories. So President Trump is married to an immigrant, J.D. Vance is married to an immigrant family, and then Kamala Harris also has her own immigrant story as well. So I think a lot of it depends on the perception of what immigrant community you belong to, right? And some of that is legal. Did you earn your way here, right? So it's tying to that independent values, or is it because you're coming here because you're looking for support, right? I think that it's about how people see themselves. And the data that I've seen coming from the Spanish speaking community here, it shows more of a generational difference. The people that have been here longer tend to lean a bit more Republican, where the others might lean more Democratic, but that's not necessarily, it looks very inconclusive in looking at the data. So who's to say, but it's very different. Like, I mean, I could point to the Cuban community in Miami, Florida, which has traditionally voted Republican. Haven't heard anyone saying that would be any different this year. So I think it's a lot of confirmation bias. I mean, I think a lot of biases are just confirmation biases. How do we see ourselves? How do we want to see the country? And that's ultimately what's going to guide how people vote.
Do you think if you would project yourself either based on evidence or, let's say, based on reasoning, how in that sense, let's say, Trump on the one hand and Kamala Harris on the other are targeting, so to say, these groups is? I mean, what in that sense are the strategies? What can they offer? And of course, we always see these big news cycles, like Trump and other Republicans focusing on the border and blaming the Democrats not doing sufficiently enough.
Right.
But of course, one could imagine, behind the scenes, there may be also nuanced messaging, etc. So, do you think is it somewhat tricky for American politicians also how to address this whole nexus of immigration and migration, or is it more bluntly and clearly how to refer to these issues? Yes. So how dialectical or how straightforward is our strategies in that context? Yes.
I think it's difficult to say. I mean, one thing that strikes me now, and it's interesting because Kamala Harris became a candidate so late. I think a lot of people are struggling to read something in there that they just didn't anticipate. And how much can we read from Biden onto Kamala Harris? That, I think, highlights one thing. But it's been noticed is that she has really not talked about identity categories broadly construed, right? She has not talked very much about being a woman of color, or brought that into things. So it is interesting that people think of that party as talking a lot about identity, but she really hasn't. She is focused on a larger message and not talk that up. Where we are, it does appear, hearing more identity issues coming from the Republican side right now. Whether or not that sways anyone, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the trend data for a while, it's people have been entrenched in these positions before we knew that Kamala Harris was a candidate. We just haven't seen a lot of movement on things. But I think identity as a broad category is hugely a major factor in this election. But how much the immigrant identity matters, I don't really know. And I think both parties believe that there is a border issue. And they're probably not so apart on how they would handle the border issue. It's become a
Mhm.
rhetorical issue.
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, should Trump win? We don't know. It's possible. Maybe it's a 50-50 chance either Trump or Harris winning. Will immigration policy, I mean, do you think in that sense, will this have a major, I mean, will there be a major impact on immigration policy if either Trump wins or Harris wins? Or do you think this is in a certain sense beyond these two politicians? Is how much of an effect may have the one or other election outcome then really have on policies
Right.
and strategies and tactics being applied here?
I don't think it's going to have much of an impact at all because Trump's been president already. So we know, I mean, what would he do differently that he didn't do the first time in this area?
Mhm.
And then Kamala Harris is following Biden. So I really don't know what they have in mind other than they're talking about it here. But I would be surprised if either one of them does something against the status quo at this point.
Okay, well, that's a message, of course. um, I mean, it's maybe, I mean, since time has progressed, let's put it like the final question, and here again, having a transatlantic perspective is so on the nexus of immigration and migration. I think that's a very interesting distinction you've just drawn. What can the United States learn from Europe, and
Mhm.
what can Europe learn from the United States? Yes, so
Mhm.
in that sense, having again the bigger transatlantic picture on migration and immigration, and then of course maybe some nuances for social media.
Mhm.
But is there a learning potential, so to say? Do you think developments will be similar or not necessarily? Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think that they can learn from one another because at the base level, we're talking about communities that are displaced for one reason or another and relocated. And I think some of the most powerful uses of social media are at those local levels, whether it's about providing health care or providing information about health. Or providing support for trauma. I mean, those things are not necessarily political issues, but I think those are shared research that exists and that there can be some points there as well.
Okay, fine. Any final statement you would like to
No, thank you
communicate
very much.
to our
It's been very
audience?
fun.
Okay. Well, in that sense, we have arrived at the end. First of all, many thanks to Professor Hickerson from the University of Mississippi for having joined our debate on a topic which is very interesting, not the least, of course, because of the possible political ramifications in the near future. Many thanks to the audience, which has, in that sense, accompanied us and listened. In that sense, a nice early afternoon to Mississippi,
Thank you.
and a good evening to Europe. And we will see what the future is going to bring. And in less than 4 weeks, we will know more about possibly more about the outcome of the US elections, but maybe even in 2 months from now, they will be legally contested, so to say. Well, thank you all, and good evening, good afternoon.